Picture this. It's 1995 and Toy Story is released to the world. The first ever Pixar movie and the first ever CG animated movie. A landmark in animation history and film history as a whole. Animation prior to that was mostly 2D animated, but with Toy Story, the floodgates were opened. Slowly but surely, 3D animation would rise in popularity while 2D animation would decline in popularity. This was further escalated in 2001 thanks to a little movie called Shrek, which, in addition to escalating the rise of 3D animation, would also show that other animation studios can take their shot at making animated movies, and that we didn't just have to rely on Disney only. Throughout the early to mid 2000s, 3D animation started to rise and 2D animation started to decline. By the mid to late 2000s, 2D animation was basically dead. Only on very rare occasions in the 2010s would you find an animated movie that's 2D animated, or at least in the case of Sponge Out of Water, it's primarily 2D animated for most of it. I've seen quite a fair amount of people say that they want 2D animation to make a comeback. They want more 2D animated movies. A few months ago, during the 2024 Oscars, Studio Ghibli's The Boy and the Heron would win Best Animated Feature over Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, a movie that people thought would win Best Animated Feature. Whether it deserved to win over Across the Spider-Verse or not is very debatable. I've yet to watch it, so I unfortunately cannot say if it deserved it or not, but a lot of people pointed to its win as a big milestone. It was the first anime movie and the first 2D animated movie to win Best Animated Feature at the Oscars since fellow Studio Ghibli movie Spirited Away, which won the Oscar back in 2003. Ever since the Oscars introduced the Best Animated Feature category, a large majority of the movies that would win were 3D animated movies. It's with this movie's win, alongside many other things, that contribute to people wanting to see 2D animation make a comeback of some sort. On the rare instances where we get a new 2D animated movie, people hype it up, asking people to go and see it on the basis that it's 2D animated. And now this is where I come in with my personal take on this. For me, I don't care at all, and I don't see what the big deal is. I would like to preface this by saying that this is not a video criticizing those that prefer 2D animation over 3D animation. I'm sure people have valid reasons as to why they prefer 2D over 3D, but more so this is a video where I just talk about why I don't think it's as big of a deal as people make it out to be. I understand it sucks that 2D animation, hand-drawn, quote-unquote, traditional animation isn't popular anymore like it was back in the 80s and 90s, but at the same time, when you really think about it, animation is animation. Who gives a shit if it's 2D animated or 3D animated? Why does that matter? What difference does it make if a movie is animated in 2D or in 3D? As long as the movie is good, that's all that matters. You can still praise the quality of an animated movie's animation. Like, if it looks amazing, then you can acknowledge, yeah, the animation is really good. But specifically making a big deal about the style of animation that the film has. If it's 2D animated or 3D animated, it's just like, what difference does it make? What's the point? The movie is good. That's all that matters. Who cares if it's 2D animated or 3D animated? Listen, I promise you all, the Disney Renaissance, they would still be great movies, even if they were 3D animated. Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast and Hercules and whatever, they would still be great movies even if they were 3D animated, even if they had the same animation style as Frozen or Moana. Likewise, Toy Story and Shrek would still be considered great movies if they were both 2D animated. Actually, no, if Toy Story was a 2D animated movie, it would still be considered great, of course, don't get me wrong, but it wouldn't have that historical importance behind it. The whole thing of it being the first ever 3D animated movie, it obviously wouldn't be there if the movie was 2D animated. Instead of being considered one of the most important animated movies ever made, one of the most important movies ever made in general, Toy Story would be seen as just another animated movie, and that's it. It would very likely still be considered a great movie, don't get me wrong, but like, there would be nothing to make it special or unique. There would be nothing to make it stand out from other animated movies from around the same time. The fact of the matter is, 2D animation wasn't going to last forever in a post-Toy Story landscape. The moment Toy Story was released to the world, it opened up the floodgates. There was a new style of animation for studios to experiment with. Eventually, 2D animation was gonna die down in popularity and 3D animation would become the norm. It would take a while before that happened, but it would happen eventually. And lo and behold, it did happen. The way that I see it, for a long time, all the way up to late 1995, it was just 2D animation, and that's it. And then, in late 1995, Toy Story would be released to the world, the first ever 3D animated movie. Animation would never be the same. And yet, despite that, 3D animation was still in its early stages, so in the late 90s, you were still getting mostly 2D animated movies, with the occasional 3D animated movie thrown in. And then this carried on into the very early 2000s. You had a mixture of 2D animated movies and 3D animated movies. And then everything changed in 2001 when a little movie named Shrek would be released. A movie that would further escalate the rise of 3D animation and the decline of 2D animation. The sad truth is, the moment 3D animation was introduced, nobody wanted to go back to 2D animation. I want to imagine maybe there were a lot of benefits to animating in 3D over animating in 2D. Maybe it was easier to do it compared to 2D animation. Maybe it was quicker. Maybe it's easier to fix animation errors in 3D when compared to in 2D. I have no idea at all. But I think the main reason for why 3D animation replaced 2D animation was just because 3D was seen as more impressive, more revolutionary. And considering the current era of animated movies that we're living in right now, you know, the next year, Toy Story turns 30 years old. I know that's crazy. I know a lot of you are gonna feel really old just hearing that, but it's true. Next year, Toy Story will turn 30 years old. And we are still finding new ways to experiment with 3D animation. If you look at movies like Spider-Verse, Puss in Boots, The Last Wish, TMNT Mutant Mayhem, etc., there is even less of a chance that 2D animation will make a comeback. Why would animation studios go back to making 2D animated movies like it's the 90s again, when right now they're busy experimenting with 3D animation and doing new things with it? I just don't see 2D animation making a comeback, unfortunately. I'm not against the idea of 2D animation making a comeback. I don't think it'll be as big of a deal as other people make it out to be, but I'm not against the idea of it coming back. But I just don't see it realistically happening. Things change. It's an evolution is what it is. It's a form of evolution. There's nothing wrong with preferring 2D animation over 3D animation, and yeah, I can understand how it feels, the fact that like 3D animation has become the norm and 2D animation isn't popular anymore, but that's evolution for you. Things change. It's the exact same thing with video games. You know, it's just the weirdest thing. I thought about this very recently. I think this might have been the thing that made me want to make this video. It's so weird to me that, like, people complain about how, like, every animated movie coming out nowadays is 3D, and, like, there's no 2D animated movies coming out, but, like, nobody does the same thing for video games at all. I've never seen anyone say, oh, I hate the fact that every video game coming out nowadays has 3D graphics. I miss when video games were pixelated. I miss when video games had 8-bit graphics, 16-bit graphics, whatever. Like, nobody says that because it's stupid. There's nothing wrong with preferring games with pixelated graphics over games with 3D graphics, but making an unnecessarily big deal about how you want games with pixelated graphics to come back is just stupid. You would look like an idiot doing it. It's the exact same thing with 2D animation versus 3D animation. There are a lot of problems with the current state of the gaming industry, but I don't think the lack of 8-bit or 16-bit games is one of them. And I don't think making a bunch of Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis style games like it's the 90s again, I don't think that's gonna help solve, crunch culture, microtransactions, layoffs, any of the big problems that the gaming industry has right now. And again, it's a form of evolution. Nintendo isn't just gonna randomly start making 8-bit NES style games again. Every future game they're gonna make, it's gonna be 3D. At most, you'll probably get like a full-fledged 3D remake of an older NES, Super Nintendo, Game Boy era game, like the Mario RPG remake, for example. You think back to the mid-90s, the PS1 and the N64 would be coming out, 3D gaming was finally here. You had games, Crash Bandicoot and Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Sonic Adventure, it was obvious that 3D gaming was going to become the norm. A lot of video games that started off with 8-bit or 16-bit graphics, they would eventually make the jump to 3D. Sometimes these transitions to 3D wouldn't end up being very good, but more often than not, they were successful. Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, Sonic Adventure, Final Fantasy VII, GTA 3, these franchises, they weren't going to stay 2D forever. The moment the PS1 and N64 and Dreamcast and whatever, the moment these systems came out, they were gonna become 3D. And in some instances, it's for the better that they transitioned into 3D. Could you imagine how different GTA would be if it stayed with the top-down 2D perspective that the first two games had? You know how GTA 6 is like the most highly anticipated, heavily demanded video game of all time? Like, there has never been a single video game that has generated the level of excitement that GTA 6 has generated. This is the game that will hopefully either end or prevent the second video game crash that somehow hasn't happened yet. Yeah, all that hype, excitement, whatever that people feel for GTA 6, nobody would be feeling it if the series stayed with the top-down 2D perspective that the first two games had. It's called evolution. Things change. I know people like to meme on the whole Sonic had a rough transition to 3D stuff that like IGN and whatever say, but like imagine if people unironically said that for Mario or Zelda or whatever. Imagine thinking like Mario was only good when he was pixelated, and then once he became 3D, that's when he started to suck. Like, that's stupid. Preferring the pixelated NES, Super Nintendo Mario games, like, that's fine. But then like downright saying that like Mario in 3D is bad is just really stupid. And again, the main thing to take away from the pixelated games versus 3D game stuff, much like with the 2D animation versus 3D animation stuff, is that it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. As long as the game is good, that's all that matters. You can play an old 16-bit Super Nintendo game from the early 90s and then move on to an Xbox 360 game from the late 2000s, and you would be able to enjoy both. As long as the game is good, as long as you're having a fun time playing it, that's all that matters, really. I don't really understand the whole, like, big deal about, like, 2D animation versus 3D animation, like, why people have such a divide between the two. And I can't help but feel like it's just largely nostalgia bias that's speaking. It's nostalgia bias that's affecting people's opinion on this debate. Like, no duh, if you grew up religiously watching the Disney Renaissance in the 90s, of course you're gonna prefer 2D animation over 3D animation. animation. If you grew up religiously watching Pixar and DreamWorks in the 2000s, of course you're going to prefer 3D animation over 2D animation. That's how nostalgia bias works. I like the thing that I grew up with more than the thing that I didn't grow up with. And I can understand being disappointed that like something that you grew up with isn't there anymore, or like it's still there but it's only like extremely rare. I get that, it sucks, but at the same time I feel like you shouldn't downplay 3D animation either, because you can make beautiful stuff with 3D animation. 3D animation still requires a lot of hard work and effort. I'm not sure if it's easier to do than 2D animation. I'm gonna go ahead and admit that I have no idea how to animate. I am terrible at drawing, and I can't even imagine what it would be like if I attempted to make a 3D model. I have no idea how long it takes to animate something in 2D or 3D. But either way, I know that it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort regardless. And I feel like maybe you shouldn't underplay the hard work and time that's put into animating a movie in 3D just because you miss 2D animation. Besides, being 2D animated shouldn't be the end all be all when it comes to determining the quality of an animated movie. If Disney was still making 2D animated movies, if all of their modern animated movies were 2D animated, they would still not be good. If Wish was 2D animated, it still wouldn't be a good movie. If Wish was a 2D animated movie, that wouldn't change the fact that it's extremely bland and generic and forgettable and derivative of older Disney movies. Actually no, if Wish was 2D animated, that probably would make it even more derivative than it already is. I could easily see an alternate universe where everything about Wish is the same, except that it's a 2D animated movie. Disney would advertise this movie claiming that it is their first 2D animated movie in a very long time. A return to the style of the Disney Renaissance classics that they put out in the 90s to honor their 100-year anniversary. And that would likely cause people to go into the theaters to watch the movie, and then the movie ends up being the most generic, forgettable thing you've ever seen in your life. I mean, to be fair, in this alternate universe, there's a chance that the movie wouldn't end up being a massive box office flop, for better or worse. It would probably do the same critically, but commercially it might do better, so yeah, I don't know. The most important thing is we don't live in that timeline. But I just wanted to put that out there. Wish probably would have been worse if it was 2D animated, in a way. Like, it would feel like an even more insulting way to celebrate Disney's 100-year anniversary if it was 2D animated. Just think about that, please. If a new 2D animated movie comes out at any point in the future, the main selling point for it shouldn't be it's a 2D animated movie, but rather it should be it's a good movie. Because again, at the end of the day, that's all that matters. Who cares if it's 2D animated or 3D animated? It doesn't matter. Animation is animation. And that's all that I'm gonna say. Anyways, that's about it. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and I will see you all next time. Adios.